In this video, I'm going to show you how to take a simple design like this and turn it into something a little bit more eye-catching like this. Let's go. All right, so here we are in Photoshop, and the design can be broken up into 3 parts, which I have separated into folders. So I have the textures at the top, I have the actual design itself, and then I have the background. So I'm going to break down this design for you, and I'm going to walk you through my thought process as if I was designing it for the first time. So we're going to start off with the background first thing. All right, so here's the design completely stripped down. So I've removed all of the textures, I've removed all of the layer styles. So I'm just going to open the background folder here. I actually started off with a yellow background, so I used the color fill. To add that, you just press this button here, and then you come up to solid color, and then you just choose whichever color you want. The next thing I decided to do was I wanted to add some sort of texture to the background. So then I decided to add some repeating text, and the text I repeated was what I have here. So all I feel is this groove, and I wanted it to be a little bit more subtle. So in order to do that, I open the layer styles and bring the fill opacity all the way down. And then I decided to add an inner glow and then an outer glow as well. So you can see that it really fades into the background and it's not as distracting as it was before, which is what I was going for. I then added this gradient map that transitions from black to yellow. So what this does is it actually helps darken the darker values in the background a little bit. So the next thing I decided to do was add a border around the design. So I actually used the rectangle tool for this, and I have the pixels set to 5, and I have it set to a dashed line with a dash of 1 and a gap of 5. And then I decided to add a layer mask so that I could erase the parts of the border that meet the text around here. So from here, the next thing I would do if I was creating this design from scratch, I would start experimenting with textures. So what you would want to do is you would want to find some textures and just bring them in and start experimenting with the blending modes and layering them on top of each other until you find a set of textures that works well with the design. So just for a quick example, I'll paste a texture that I already have used in this design. So this is what the normal paper texture looks like. So you would want to come up here to the blending modes, and you would just want to start experimenting with each of these and just find one that works well with the design for this particular texture. So since experimenting with textures can take a while, I'm just going to walk you through each texture that I use in this particular design and explain how I use them. So if I open the texture group here, you can see all the textures that I use. I'm actually only using 6 different textures here, but a few of them are layered on top of each other and they're using different blending modes for each. So the first texture I use is a halftone texture. So if I turn it on normally, that's what it looks like. And I had it set to hard mix, so I'm just going to bring it down to hard mix over here. And you can see what that does. It adds these lighter dots in the light areas and these darker dots in the dark areas. If I zoom in here, you can see the difference it makes when I turn it on and off. Just like that. And then the next texture I'm using on top of that is the exact same one, except I have it set to lighter color, as you can see here. And so what that does is that it actually turns the darker dots in the dark areas white. So if I turn that off like that, and I turn it back on, you can see the difference it makes. So the next texture I have are these folds that look like paper. This is what it looks like normally. And then I had this set to hard light as well. So you can see that it actually looks like the design was printed and then scanned back into a computer. And then the next texture I'm using on top of that is a vintage dust texture. So this is what it looks like originally. And I have it set to linear dodge. And the main thing that this does is it actually lightens the darker values in the design, but there's also various white scratches that can be seen in certain areas. So now that I've explained the first few, I'll just turn the rest on one by one rather than explaining in detail, so you can just see what difference that texture actually makes to the overall design. So I'll take this grunge one, I'll turn it on. You can see that it darkens some of the values here. And then this is the exact same one, just flipped around, and it darkens some of the values over here as well. And then we have this grit texture, which is very apparent in the darker values. You have these sort of white streaks that go along the design. And then I have this paper texture, another paper texture, which changes the hue a bit, and then another paper texture, and then another paper texture on top of that. One thing I also want to point out is that the order that you place the layers in does make a difference. So for example, if I were to take this vintage dust texture and move it to the top, you can see the subtle difference that it makes when I move it back and forth. So yeah, this is where experimentation really starts to come into play. There really is no right or wrong way to use these textures. You'll want to experiment not only with the blending modes, but also the order of the layers as well when it comes to the textures. So you may or may not have noticed that I've had this hue saturation layer sitting at the top this whole time, and at the beginning the design was actually blue. And so I wanted to share a bonus tip in this video, which I've shared in my previous videos before, on how to quickly experiment with color palettes. So if I turn this hue saturation layer on, nothing changes obviously, but then once you start to change the value of the hues, you can see that the overall color palette starts to really change. And this is honestly just a foolproof way of changing the colors of the overall design without having to go in and actually change the original color of everything. And the amazing thing is with this method is that as long as the original colors you have work well with each other, usually no matter what you set the hue value to, the colors will continue to work well with each other. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this to the blue color that we originally had. All right, so now that we have our textures and our color set for our design, the next thing I would do if I was creating this design from scratch, I would start experimenting with layer styles for the base design. So what I mean by base design is the actual illustration and the text that we have in the design here. So opening the design group here, we're going to go to illustration and I'm going to show you the layer styles that I have set. So on the actual illustration, I only have a drop shadow. So if we turn that on, this is what that looks like. And then if we open the layer styles panel here, you can see that I actually have the color set to red for the drop shadow for the illustration. And the reason why it's not coming up as red is, if you remember, we have the hue saturation adjustment layer set to the top. So if I were to hide this, you could actually see the red in the design and how once I turn the hue saturation layer on, it turns it into a blue or like a turquoise blue. And one thing I want to point out specifically is that I intentionally decide to experiment with textures before layer styles. And this is exactly why. Layer styles can have some really cool interactions with the textures. And just to prove that to you, I'm actually going to turn the texture group off. So if you were to see this design like this, I mean, like it kind of looks okay, but then even if I were to turn the hue saturation layer off, this just doesn't look that great to me. It's not something that I would have kept and continued on to design with. So imagine if early on in the design, I had started experimenting with layer styles first, I probably would not have been able to come up with this cool effect afterwards because I wouldn't have kept the layer style because the red just doesn't look that great to me, right? So that's why I think it's a good idea to experiment with textures first and then layer styles second, because the interactions between the textures and the layer styles can cause some really cool results. So turning the texture group and the hue saturation layer back on, I'm going to go through the rest of the design. So I also have some layer styles set for the text as well. So if I open this, I actually have a group within a group here. So in the first group, I have the actual text you can see here, and then I have the layer styles set on the group that contains the text. So if I turn the effects on here, you can see the little bit that it does add. But one thing I also want to point out is that I have an inner shadow set, but in order to make this inner shadow a little bit more apparent, I'm going to turn the fill opacity down. And you can see if I switch between, you can see that the text sort of lightens up a little bit. If I were to come to the inner shadow and I were to decrease the opacity, you could see the effect that the inner shadow actually has, and even the size as well. So yeah, for this first group, I have a stroke, an inner shadow, and an outer glow. So this is the outer glow. This is what it looks like. And then I have a stroke to sort of clean it up a little bit. And then I have an inner shadow used on the actual text. And then I have this group placed within another group, and I also have effects on that one. So if I turn this one on, you can see the effects that it gives. So I have a drop shadow that is also red. You can see that the red actually turns into like a turquoise. And then I have an outer glow and a stroke as well. So we're almost done with the design. There's two more things I would do from here. So the first thing I would do if I was creating this design from scratch is I would add just a little bit more texture, something similar to like an ink bleed effect. So I have this spatter layer here. I can turn it on and you can see that it adds these little speckles and dots of black all around the design, which sort of replicates an ink bleed effect. And I did this by just using a brush tool and setting my brush to one of these spatter brushes, and then just going ahead and adding some speckles wherever I see fit. So that's the second last thing that I would do. And then the very last thing I would do is I would add a distress effect over the actual contents of the design. So in order to do that, I would just use a layer mask. So I would add a layer mask right here, but I already have a layer mask on there with the distress effect set. And if I reveal it, you could see the distress effect. If I hide it and reveal it, you can see the difference that it makes. And so in order to do this is I just grab my brush tool. I use the exact same spatter brush and just start going in and erasing parts of the design to add a distress effect. If you found this video helpful, please consider hitting that like button below, subscribe for more, and I'll catch you in the next one.